So podcast 19, we're picking up the storyline kind of where we left off from the last one, sex in the church.
This is probably a kind of a boring way for us to start because we normally don't start this well, you know. So we should be messing around for a few minutes before we get there, right?
I suppose.
Whatever. We've been talking for over what 50 minutes so far, so we're trying to figure out what we're doing today.
So we're now just going to let people start listening to what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
If I was listening to my own podcast, I would be totally offended that we talked for 50 minutes without letting them in on the conversation, which has now been lost to human history and the entire pool of human knowledge because we didn't record it.
Well, it's probably a good idea because I know what we talked about. We spared a lot of people.
Yeah, probably.
From a lot of nonsense.
Right.
So we were talking about standards and how that happens in the church, and we were talking about sex in the church. So yeah, where we go from there and how sex is viewed in the church in so many different from so many different dynamics. It's not a simple topic.
Well, one of the challenges that we're trying to deal with is what's actually included in the issue of sexuality, sexual gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual expression, experimentation, monogamy, sexual isolation, the idea of whether a person is active sexually with a marriage partner, with other partners, with same-sex people. I mean, the issues are huge. And then age level issues with a child, with a very young child, with an older teen, when, where is the dividing line of what is appropriate and not appropriate, what's legal and not legal, what's moral and not moral. I mean, those issues cross all the boundaries. And the struggle that the church has in dealing with itself in its own identity and how to deal with persons in the world and coming from the world into the church as to what does it mean and what standards are we to have. And that's just an incredibly challenge. Even to talk about it is a very, very difficult topic.
Because when we start, we have those conversations, regardless of whether it's about sex, but standards within principles, if you will, biblical principles, biblical standards within the church itself. And when you go down that road, and now in that same conversation, you cannot walk away without inserting grace into that conversation. And how do those two actually interact at a level that makes sense and stays, if you would, within the confines of biblical understanding, so that we are redemptive in the nature of, there is a difference. I mean, I'm not, not ashamed to say that there is a difference in understanding what it means to be a Christian versus not. But grace plays a huge part of this whole thing. And so it seems to me that within the confines of the church, there is, we're getting a lot more strident type of things going on from the standards part and leaving grace pretty well beat up in the background because we don't quite know what to do with that and how that works. And that is not a simple conversation.
So you used a metaphor of grace being beat up in the background. I have no idea what that means.
I said that just for you because I knew that you would like obsessed with that and not
I'm
hear
not
one other thing I
obsessed with
say.
it. It just makes no
Yeah.
sense. If we're going to use metaphors, one of the challenges of thinking is I can understand how a metaphor functions in a visual image, but translating that into how do I deal with actual real human beings with whom I have encounters as to what is my next step? What do I say? How do I embrace or refrain from embracing relative to actual real people if Grace is beat up in the background? I know some people named Grace, so I imagine people that I know, sorry for all of you, I don't know any men who are named Grace, but I
See,
know
this
several
is what
women
I
who are
love.
named Grace, and they're beat up in the background. That's like really now we're into misogyny and all other kinds of stuff. And it's like, wait a minute. So explain what you mean by
I
beating up
don't need
Grace
a
in the
lesson.
background.
I don't need a lesson in metaphors on how to use them or not use them.
Right. So you had a metaphor that makes no sense to me. What does it mean?
All you could have done is ask that. I would
I
have
did.
helped
And
you.
then you said, I am obsessing about it. And I said, I'm not obsessing about it. I'm just asking a question. Who
No,
is
you're obsessed
Grace and
about
how is she beat up in the background?
She's not a she. Wait a minute. We're
Oh,
trying to figure this out. Meaning the fact is that it seems that grace becomes a much smaller part of the conversation, where the standard in staying at this level is easier to do because grace then gets involved and it's messy. So it's easier just to kind of leave it back there and not worry about it. And that idea of where grace really needs to be in the mix and in the forefront of what we're doing as Christians no longer is there. It's just being pretty well shoved aside. And it's like, oh yeah, we kind of do that.
all right. So,
Well, but not
so
really.
for all those non-biblical scholars that are out there,
There we go.
we need to
Yep.
come up with some definitions as to what we mean by grace.
Okay.
The Greek word is charis, and a noun which goes along with charis, grace, is charisma. We use that as a person who has an outgoing personality
Right.
and they're
Exactly.
very optimistic and cheerful and they're able to take the stage and the limelight really well and they are charismatic.
Right.
Charisma means literally a thing of grace. It's a neuter word, a thing of grace or something gracious.
Mhm.
Doesn't help us with an explanation. Charis is related to the word for a gift, something given freely.
Right. Right.
So, charismata, which is a word that gets thrown around the Christian world every once in a while as spiritual gifts, is the plural of charisma, meaning things that are done by grace. So the words don't necessarily help us yet. What does it mean to show or have grace? And I was going to say towards someone else, but can you have grace towards yourself?
Mhm.
Is it permission? Is it the
Mhm.
same as forgiveness?
Mhm.
Is it the same as not caring?
Right.
Is it a lack of standards? Is it to have grace means you don't have standards or you do have standards, but you don't hold others to that standard. So, we're getting lost in, I'm getting lost in the conversation trying to understand when we use the word grace or gracious or graciousness, what does that actually mean? And if we're going to beat up grace and leave it in the background, what does that mean? So what's the opposite then of grace? If you're going to, one of the ways to understand a word is what is its opposite?
What's its opposite?
Yeah. What's the opposite of grace?
Well,
An
grace is
antonym, the opposite of grace.
so grace would be something that you have not earned and you do not deserve, been given to you, right? So the flip side of that is you get what you deserve and you get what you've earned.
So a paycheck. The
Okay.
opposite of grace is a paycheck,
Right.
is getting paid at the end of your schedule of work because you deserve that.
Well, I would say, yeah, because in that context, but if you put it in a context of a Christian, if you will, we would say in a biblical atonement perspective, is it that you don't deserve forgiveness, you're given forgiveness, right? But you can't earn that forgiveness. So there's a sentence, the easiest way is the one that's used frequently, is in a courtroom setting where you deserve to be punished for the DUI, right?
Right.
You because you earned it. You earned the DUI. You were drunk when you were driving. So you deserve to be punished. And so the sentence is 2 years in jail without without parole and or your license taken away for a lifetime.
Okay. So get to grace part.
So the grace part is the judge says, no, I'll deal with that. I'll take that. You didn't earn it. You didn't earn forgiveness. You didn't earn him taking the penalty for it. So he takes the penalty for it, serves the time, does all that. That's grace because you didn't earn it and you didn't deserve it. So grace says that that's what I do. So we put that in the standard of what we look at with when we're looking to talking about sexual issues with people, that that aspect of grace is understanding that if we are to be as Christians people of grace, then that is the question. How do we deal with someone knowingly, if you will, in our mind, because we set the standard, have earned, you know, because they broke the standard or they didn't fit the standard or don't fit the standard, then if we are going to be people of grace, we have to be able to look beyond that so that we can have real conversation with them that says, okay, how do I get there in helping them understand where I'm coming from? But I'm not sure that happens at all in most settings. It's like, well, you believe this, you do this, your action is this, you're an adulterer, you're a pedophile, you're a pornography. I mean, I have a guy right now that I stay in contact with that is in prison and he's a sex offender. Okay. You say sex offender in most churches and people just literally move away from him.
Right.
But I know the whole story behind what happened in this guy's life. And a lot of it has just been, it's just total tragedy of what's gone on, not because I'm naive and because I believe any story that anybody tells me. I actually know the story. Okay. But from that standpoint, if did he earn a lot of those things? Yes, he did. Does he deserve to be punished? Yes, he does. Does he deserve to be punished by me? No, because I'm not the guy that ultimately he has to answer to. So what's my job? My job is to give grace, which says he earned the fact that he broke the law. He deserves to be punished. Okay, great. Is that my job? No, that's not my job.
Okay. So is grace locked into a person not continuing the behavior?
That's a really good question.
So the judge, you gave the metaphor, which has actually never happened. The judge says, I'll pay your price. I'll go to prison for 2 years for you so you don't have to go.
Right.
As an example of grace, that's a parable. But the
Yeah.
parable doesn't apply in real life, because if the guy says, fine, while you're in jail, I'm going to go out to a party and keep drinking and driving. And so the
I think
judge says, oh, wait a minute. You pay for grace afterwards. That is, you stop drinking and driving. The guy who's in jail, you stop having sex with minors or with whatever your sexual sin is, a sex offender, level 1 sex offender, level 3, give them a number. That doesn't really matter to anybody. But as long as you stop violating the standard, you can have grace. Grace doesn't apply if you don't stop. So you earn it by stopping. That's
did I say that?
anti-grace.
I did say that.
Well, that's what I'm asking, because that's what you're implying.
No, I'm not implying. I didn't imply that.
So you can keep on driving drunk after you've received the grace of the judge going to jail for your sentence. No? Yes? A couple that's living together, not married, they show up at church. They're not married. They don't want to get married. They have kids. They don't have kids. They have kids from other relationships. They have other relationships. And they say, I want to be part of this church. Say, sure, you can be. We have a lot of grace for people that are not married, still living together sexually, but you have to get married before you can be a member or teach Sunday school class or sing in the choir or sing on the stage. You have to correct what we say is a violation of the standard before grace gets extended beyond our first introduction. Is that the way grace works?
Is that how you say it?
I'm asking the questions here. You're giving the answers. Don't turn the question around and shoot it
I'm
back at
asking
me.
you.
No.
No.
No, you can't do that. In a podcast, the people who are listening to this podcast want a real answer. And I get to ask the questions.
You think you get to ask the question.
Okay, well, let me think of an answer. So the issue is we're talking in the human realm.
Right.
The actual real truth is that we don't know how God himself or herself or themselves are going to deal with this, any issue of sin or wrongdoing or breaking the standards in light of grace. We don't know. We would, in the Christian realm, a person, this is odd to say, you earn grace by having faith. Faith pays for grace.
But
You
faith is
don't
nothing
get
more.
grace. Yeah. You don't get grace if you don't have faith.
Okay.
So God's grace is dangled out there like a carrot on a stick in front of a donkey. You believe and I'll show grace. And then you have to stop. I think one of the things that I told the story in church a little while ago, and it's a poignant story. When I became a Christian, it was out of secular Judaism. It was, I had no faith, no religion, no application in religious circles at all. My background is Jewish, but by biological connection to Judaism, not because of faith or obedience or kosher or Sabbath keeping or circumcision, any of those things. It wasn't about any of that at all. When I became a Christian, it was in my senior year in high school, and I really didn't have anything to do with the church. I was involved in a youth activity that had guitars and singing, and we sang secular songs, Christian songs. We had a 2-minute little mini sermonette by some guy, and we all went off to school. That was my entire experience of church, the Christian community. I went to a camp up in upstate New York that summer. It was really great. It was 5 days, 5.5 days of very intense Christianese jargon, all the words. I still didn't, I had a a Bible that they gave me that was a Good News for Modern Man. So it wasn't a real translation, it was a paraphrase. That was all that I knew. I didn't know anything at all. I came to Rochester to go to Rochester Institute of Technology, and I was working in a youth organization, said you had to go to church. So I visited a whole bunch of churches. I was bored out of my mind by every one of them. They were just silly. They stand up, sit down, wear certain clothes. I had long hair, 2.5-foot long ponytail, bright red hair, little goatee. I was a college student, freshman, engineering student, and I went into general studies. And I eventually found a little tiny church about 15 miles from my college. And I started going there, and the pastor studied Greek, and he taught really well, and it was engaging. It was very intelligent. It was really, really good environment for a young college student with a lot of questions. So I started going there, and I joined as a member. That church had a Sunday morning service, a Sunday evening service, and a Wednesday night service. I went to all three. I was just captivated. This was just absolutely fascinating. I remember one Sunday evening, we were having a sing-spiration. This is back in the early 70s. And they would have a hymn sing.
You are old.
I am old. And they would have a hymn sing, and they would go song after song. There was no Bible study. There was no sermon. Everybody loved having no sermon. It was like we went to church and didn't have a sermon. That was the biggest thing in the world. And I remember one night, I'm serious, do not laugh about this. And if you're watching this podcast years from now and you start laughing about this, I'm going to hunt you down and tell you stop laughing. So we're having a Sunday evening sing-spiration. We're singing all these songs. And there is a hymn, which is a famous hymn, really great hymn. And the chorus of it is, "It is well with my soul." So everybody's singing with gusto, and they're singing for all they're worth. I'm this long-haired hippie kid that's dressed in grunge. I'm as rich as people can be, and I just look like a tramp. And so and they loved me. They thought that was really great because they were all straight-laced Baptist-y people that wore ties and suits and everything. And one of the guys, one of the older men, I think he was around 85 or 90. I mean, really, he was old, wrinkled, white hair, old guy. We all called him Uncle Sam. Everybody called him Uncle Sam. And if anybody's old enough to remember Uncle Sam, he's the nicest guy in the world. So I'm not disparaging Uncle Sam or the Uncle Sams of the world at all. So don't send me nasty letters that I'm mean to old people, because I'm an old guy now myself. So we're singing along, and I was literally singing, "It is swell with my soul." And after church was over, Uncle Sam said, could he speak to me privately? I'm not sure. He's in a dark suit, white shirt, starch collar, narrow tie, wonderful guy, super old, very wonderful person. And we sat down. I can still remember this as plain as day. And he said, I want to speak to you about your language. I said, okay. I'm thinking, did he hear me in the parking lot? I mean, I'm a pretty rough person anyway. He said, it is not appropriate for a Christian young man to use certain words. And I said, you got me. What did I say? He said, we were singing a song, "It is well with my soul." It's okay. He said, you used the wrong word that Christian men are not to use. Swell. And I could see his face blanch. Please don't use that word. And my brain is going, swell is a curse word. I'm not supposed to say it is swell with my soul. And somehow we resolved the conversation. And I said, well, I'm so sorry. You know, I'll do my best not to continue using that word. And I walked out of that church. And here's the lesson I took from it. There are all kinds of rules in the church that I have no idea which ones I'm violating. when am I going to run into the next rule that I break that I didn't even know I was breaking? It was not Christian young men need to clean up their language, that we need to live moral lives. It was the church has rules that once I signed up to be a Christian, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. That they talked about grace for sin, but they didn't really mean that. There really isn't grace for sin because you're going to keep on breaking the rules and we're going to keep pointing it out. So it took me a very long time before I began to wrap my mind around why do we have so many unspoken, we have a lot of spoken and written rules, but the ones that are really the most trouble are the ones that nobody will write down, and
Right.
they won't really talk about them.
Right.
So
Right.
you have a person who is exploring their sexuality, or they just dress a little funky, or they, back in the 70s and 80s, a boy had an earring. It's like, oh my goodness, the whole world has just come to an end. You have, is it in your right ear or your left ear? What do you, and it's like, why do you care? You don't have an earring, good for you. You're not gay, great, thumbs up. But why do I have to live according to your standard? And why can you have no grace towards me as a person when you talk about grace all the time as if it's a real dynamic, not only in your own life, but that comes from God?
Right.
But it doesn't really. Grace is not really gracious. It's tied to something. And that's where I think when we get into the issue of sexual sin, we call it sin. It's a failure. It's breaking the system. It's not living up to the standards. It's somehow we've got to maintain the rules or the entire world is going to fall apart. And if the world falls apart, the entire universe is going to fall apart, and God will not be God if he lets us get away with it. I mean, that to me is where the discussion within humanity as well as in the church is really best held, but I don't know if we can hold it.
Right.
So you violate a standard by using the word swell, or having sex with someone you're not married to, or who's not from your race, or who's not from your age group, or
Right.
who's not
Right.
from the opposite gender, or doesn't fit society's expectations or demands, most of which come out of Bible verses that are held to be universals, absolutes. And the question is, where is grace in that context?
Right. Right.
So if you have to pay for grace, it isn't grace anymore.
Right.
And
Exactly.
does faith, even faith in Jesus, does that pay for the grace that you get?
Well, but faith is not faith unless it has an object in which it has faith in.
Okay, sure.
And it's
So
not
what
a
does that
it's
mean?
so it's not about the amount of faith that you have, it's what you have your faith in that
Right.
matters.
I get that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So if my faith is in the person of Christ, who is the ultimate grace, then am I paying for that? No, I have faith in him as the individual who has the grace that I receive from him. Don't deserve it. I receive from him through him as a Christian. So the question then boils itself back down, because I agree with you. The fact is that we enter into so many situations that, lest we border on the line here of people listening to this think that you and I don't have any standards in our lives or any principles of which we live by, which is not true. But the reality is when it comes into the interaction with other individuals, am I a person that because I have this faith in the person of Christ who gives me grace, am I capable of utilizing that to give grace to others regardless of what the circumstances are? Or do I have a set preconceived notion that if someone comes to me and says, you know, um, I have someone who comes to me and confesses that they struggle with, all kinds of pornographic issues and they're sexually addicted, then do I set them aside or put them into some other category because that's an unspoken thing that, well, we can't really have that person be involved in, helping out with young people or anything else. Now, some of it's common sense. If they're a person who's addicted to pedophilia, yeah, I mean, obviously you understand those things, but does that mean I treat them differently as a holistic, as a person that says I can give you grace as an individual? Now, how that works itself out in the work of the spiritual, of God working in and through their lives, through the person of Christ, that's not my job. My job is to keep the door open, to have those conversations, to help point them to the place where I know they can actually get healing through the person of Christ, because it's a spiritual issue. I am not spirit, I am human.
Right.
But my obligation is to help them be connected in grace just the way I am, where my faith is placed, which is in Christ, who gives, who gives me grace. So my job is to help them be able to experience the same thing, because of the changes in my life that I know that God's done through the person of Christ in and through my life. So lest people think that we're not about change in individuals' lives and coming into relationship here with the person of Christ, that there's nothing's further. I mean, no, we're all about that. But understanding how grace actually works in the context of this kind of thing of interaction, you and I exude grace to each other all the time because we don't agree on everything
Yeah,
that we
but
talk
that's
about.
because it's easy for us.
Yeah, right. Wait a minute. It may be easy for you because you're having to give it to me. I'm not sure that.
It's easy for me because I really don't care. I mean, that's part of the. It's
You weren't
harder
gonna.
for you
I
because
was
you care
trying
about
to be.
stuff like this. Yeah, I know.
I was trying to be nice, but obviously that's not
Nice.
gonna work.
That
Yeah,
word
I know
means
what it. I know what
ignorant.
it means.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
know, and foolish. I guess.
I think that the challenge, the church, for some reason, has revolved around sexuality issues as the most important kinds of sin, probably since the beginning of the church. It
Well, which is
in the Bible, it was really about idolatry. It was
right,
having false gods
right,
and 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 worshiping other nations' gods as if they were God the creator.
right.
We have in our contemporary culture very little understanding of what idolatry really is. And so
Which
we say, oh, it's idolatry to worship a football team or to worship a movie star or a musician or television or blah, blah, blah. And we turn that on to idolatry. We have no idea. But the idea of what really disqualifies a person from a relationship with God because they violated a standard, a lot of that in the church revolves around human sexuality of some kind.
Right. Which you and I both have talked about this numerous times, which is so fascinating because that issue is way down the list of things that is talked about in scripture.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, money is talked about far more in scripture than sex, but idolatry has got to be, if not the top one, of exchanging something else in relationship for who God is.
Idolatry and power. Those are the two
Yes,
top,
yes,
and they're
yes,
interrelated with each other. But
yes,
power, the
exactly.
use of power by the powerful against the powerless.
Right. And greed is right in there with those top three.
Right, because
And
they're linked into both of those.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
So
And yet in our society, when's the last time you've heard anything talked about that in the church, of where we actually talk about that concept of greed and how that works itself out, and the kind of dynamic that happens when that becomes central in our lives, which is kind of a big deal, you know. But it's so fascinating because I I remember studying First John. I was getting ready to preach the last of First John a bunch of years ago, and forever, uh, not forever, but for a significant amount of time, that last little line of what he says in First John is, "Little children, keep yourself from idols." That's it. I mean, it's like he does this whole thing about love and so on and so on, and he gets down to that very last closing in the first, First John, and that's what he says. And I always found that to be such a curious closing of a book, and until I started digging into what he was saying. And in essence, what he was saying is that, he's saying, look, don't allow anything to creep into your life that controls you and you're obsessed with, that is controlling the outcomes of how you live. And I'm like, oh my word, what an incredible what an incredible concept, the concept of understanding what idolatry is. Because we talk about, you're right, talking about football teams and so on, but the really ones are, what are the things in our lives that we are allowing to control us, and they are inserting themselves into our lives daily, that keep us focused in another place that is anywhere else but in the person of Christ. That it is a control obsession, if you will, at that point, which we would say is high on our list in the emotional aspect of acceptance,
right.
that becomes
But
idolatry.
if then obsession or outright control is the issue, then when somebody says, well, I look at pornography, but I'm not obsessed with it. It's just a
Yeah.
relaxation. I mean, I read
Yeah.
murder mysteries and I read the comics in the paper and I look at pornography and enjoy the human form, and I say, so it's not it's not an idolatry. So the issue comes over, how does grace apply if the behavior isn't interrupted or stopped according to a standard? And the challenge, I think, that we have in the church, it's an organizational thing. It's really something that has to do with how the church has developed as an entity as opposed to a relationship. We can squawk all we want about the church being a community and it's about relationships, but it's really about structures. So if I meet two gay or lesbian friends, two women, two men, it doesn't matter. Just pick any topic you want, and we're at Walmart, and I see them walking along holding hands, and they're shopping for whatever. I can greet them. It's no issue. I can show grace. But as soon as they walk in the organized church, now all of a sudden there's an issue. If they say, could you lend me $20? We don't have enough money to get the whatever food we need. no problem. If they say in the church, we'd like to teach Sunday school class. Wow. Now there's an issue. It's something that has to do with the way the church has organized formally that has an element of power in it that somehow we feel we need to protect. And then the closer you get to the column of power, I just made that up, the column of power, and move up the power column, that's an interesting idea. We should do a podcast entirely on the column of power. I mean, sitting here, I just came up with that. When you get into, there's a structure, but it's held up by a column. And what is the column? It's something official.
Right.
You can talk here in the narthex about ideas you have on First John. But as soon as you want to get into the column of power and be a Sunday school teacher or a small group leader, well, now we've got a real issue here. What if you want to be licensed for ministry in the church? Well, oh my goodness, you're in the column of power and you've moved up. What if you want to be a worship team leader in front of other people, representing the church on our videos or in our services? Well, you're now higher on the column of power. What if you want to be ordained as a staff pastor or the lead pastor or the executive pastor or the president of our association? You've moved up the column of power, and now those issues, you're not married to the person you're living with, you got divorced, you have children out of wedlock, you masturbate for sexual relief, you're associated with a gay partner, you're married to somebody not from your own race. I mean, pick the topic that has to do with human sexuality in the column of power. As you move up the column of power, that's where the issue, grace no longer applies. And I think my mind is going like 12 directions at the same time. That would be a fascinating and extremely difficult thing to talk about. And it's true in Rotary, it's true in politics, it's true in anything that has, I mean, in politics, skip the church entirely. Somebody is running for office. I'm in New York State, where Mario Cuomo is a governor. And right now we're in the middle of an accusation by 8, 9, 10, 11. I mean, a number keeps growing as the days go by, of women who are accusing Andrew Cuomo of sexual impropriety. There was a football quarterback who got accused over this last weekend by 7, 8, 9 massage parlor massage therapists for exposing himself. There's sexual issues that pertain. So the question then is with Andrew Cuomo, one of the accusers, I am not demeaning her accusation. One of the women said, he looked down my blouse when I leaned over. What? That now is, that's sexual abuse, to look down somebody. How did we get there in our society? But this has been going on for decades and decades and decades. There was a guy running for president of the United States years and years ago that said to the media, you watch me, watch everything in my life, and let's find out if I'm a moral person or not. So the media followed him around with these long distance telescopic cameras, and they saw him on a boat with somebody he wasn't married to, who had the top of her 2-part bikini off, and he got thrown out of the race. Ravi Zacharias. I mean, the thing is collapsing around sexual issues that pertain to this column of power. If somebody was just out in the world that had sex with a massage therapist, to be like, yeah, you're an idiot, or you got away with it, or I mean, that's what you paid her for. I mean, who knows? But you get into the column of power in the church, And now all of a sudden, that becomes the unforgivable sin. So for Ravi Zacharias, bookstores are dropping his books. Christian book distributors are out, gone. We're not selling our stuff. He is out. He is absolutely out. Where is grace? I mean, the guy is dead. He died
Right.
months ago.
Right.
Where is grace? It got beat up and thrown in the background.
See?
Because you can't show grace or he'll get away. Because everybody else will want to do the same thing.
Exactly.
If you say there's no consequence. But isn't that what we said at the beginning of this podcast? Grace suspends the consequence.
Yes, it does.
Because the gracious master says, I have the right to enforce it, but I'm going to suspend it.
Right. Exactly.
We can't do that. And it's something about the organized church, not just a group of friends who are Christians walking along. We're trying to help each other get there.
Right.
It is now this organizational thing that has a column of power in it that grace gets squeezed out.
Right. Right.
I don't have an answer for that. That's an entirely different podcast. But that's really the challenge. That is the challenge.
That is the challenge. And that brings us back to the very beginning of what we were saying. And I think I can't change that part. Just like when we talk about what does this do to you and what are you going to do about it from an emotional standpoint, I can't change that. You and I have had these discussions about one of the things that has happened so much over the last year or so is that all of the stirring up on social media and everything else that goes on and people have felt powerless, they've felt inadequate, they're frustrated, they're angry, all those emotions because they can't do anything about it. Instead of saying, okay, step back, what's this doing to you and what can you do about it? Well, what I can do is change how I view the issue of grace with the people I interact with. Because when I start doing that, guess what? So what does this do to me when I have this strident column of power kind of mindset that really isolates people? It's not about not having principles. We know that, but it's the reality is that it's one of the things that I guess that my dad used to say to me, who was an incredibly godly man. He used to say all the time, he'd say, son, make sure you don't burn your bridges. And what he meant by that was make sure in your relationships you keep those intact. And how are you going to do that? Because sometimes that's a real creative way of being able to figure out how what he was saying, and he was an incredibly gracious man in many levels, but he always had room for people who did not agree, people who saw things differently.
Right. And I understand that. So you have a whole bunch of young men that you're working with. You're the old dog in the room, and they're a bunch of young guys. You're trying to learn how to do it. How do I become a solid, godly man? I'll use that expression, godly man.
Sure.
And in the group, you have all these young guys. There's one of those young guys. I don't know them, so I'm just making this up.
No, that's all right.
There's one guy that's sleeping with 4 different women at the same time. None of the 4 women know it, but he knows it, and he's jumping from one bed to the next, and he's having fun. He calls it, I'm sowing my wild oats. When I finally want to pick one, settle down, have some kids, and become a suburbanite, well, I'll pick which one I like the best. You say, well, you can't treat people that way. That's treating all these women as if they're just a piece of trash, or you're just going to try them on in the clothing center and then not buy the ones you don't want. But he says, but I'm having fun. I mean, this is just, so as long as you're just a bunch of guys there, and then you have somebody else who says, I'm not going to have sex till I'm married. And everybody looks at him and says, he's totally straight-laced. He doesn't have any STDs. He doesn't have any children out of wedlock that he has to wonder. He doesn't have any skeletons in the closet he has to worry about later on. He looks at the guy that's sleeping with 4 different girls and goes, yeah, that's just too bad. The guy is really ruining his life. And the guy sleeping with 4 different women looks at him and says, that guy's having no fun. He's going to get into his 40s or 50s and wish he had had these kinds of experiences because he'll be better sexually by having a variety. And guys, stop talking to each other. Now, organize as a church. Absolutely everything changes immediately.
Right.
Because you say to the guy who's sleeping with 4 girls, you have to stop doing that or you can't be a part of what we're doing. As long as you don't have anything official, you can show grace. You say, I wouldn't do that. I think you're going to be real unhappy as time goes by, especially if the 4 women all find out about each other. But let's see how that works out. And the guy, the problem is, as long as you don't have an official organized church or synagogue or something official, it's the nature of that human organization that now those issues all matter. And what's I think fascinating is, how does grace apply when there's something official at stake? Not something moral, something official.
I think that should be our next podcast.
Did we come up with anything in this podcast that was worth listening to?
I don't know.
Well, that's probably long enough. So either you will never listen to anything we do again, or you're going to sign up for the next one and keep listening. I hope you keep listening. If you have the idea that either Mike or I actually have answers to anything, you probably ought to go on an internet search and find the next thing that's true on the internet and stay with that. The reality is, we have more questions than we have answers, but my personal self-definition is I am a constantly curious person. Constant curiosity requires you to ask questions that have no answers.
Exactly.
And so that's really where we're trying to. There's something in this issue of the official organization and the way in which it changes our understanding of sexuality and the standards, and what holding someone to those standards and showing grace, how that all applies. And what we really want you to do is wonder about that.
Yeah. So you can find us at gripandreality.com. And if you want, you can.
This is podcast number 19.
19.
So if you want to send an email, send it to Myke at grippingreality.com. If it's critical, send it to MIKE at Gripping Reality. If it's complimentary, send it to MYKE at grippingreality.com, or either one, because it doesn't matter. We share emails anyway, and who even cares?
All right. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, this is, wow. Holy cow.
Great.